Israelite.
He was taken in the night without any warning. No time to hide or fight. They came like a bees a swarming. The questions start to fly. Will he break or will he defy? Can he withstand the worst that is to come? A child in a man's clothing, resisting a fascist ploy. The underground puts iron in the heart of any boy. Swimming in a sea of pain, he knows this is the end. He hears himself whisper the name of his best friend. I never betrayed you, and I never betrayed the revolution. I just didn't want to die alone. I needed you to see me home. And if I could save you, and if I could find a solution, I'd die 1,000 times to get you out of here. Sharing the same cold cell, betrayer and betrayed. An island with two frightened castaways. Not a word is spoken. How can he explain? Through swollen eyes, they watch the dawn's first rays. It's all over now. They stand next to the wall, waiting for the fascist sword to fall. In the desperation of a young life about to end, he turns before the bullet and forgives a friend. I never betrayed you, and I never betrayed the revolution. I just didn't want to die alone. I needed you to see me home. And if I could save you, and if I could find a solution, I'd die 1,000 times to get you out of here. I never betrayed you. I never betrayed the revolution. I never betrayed you, and I never betrayed the revolution. Just didn't want to die alone. Needed you to see me home. And if I could save you, and if I could find a solution, what more is there to say? We gonna die here anyway. I never betrayed. I never betrayed you. I never betrayed you. You are the rolling ocean. You are the mighty sea. You are the breath that brings each Amambuga, amambuga, azothengisa izwe lakithi, izwe lakithi. Amambuga, amambuga, azothengisa izwe lakithi, izwe lakithi.
Amambuga azothengisa izwe lakithi, izwe lakithi. Amambuga, amambuga, azothengisa izwe lakithi, izwe lakithi.
He was taken in the night without any warning. No time to hide or fight. They came like a bees swarming. The questions start to fly. Will he break or will he defy? Can he withstand the worst that is to come? A child in a man's clothing, resisting a fascist ploy. The underground puts iron in the heart of any boy. Swimming in a sea of pain, he knows this is the end. He hears himself whisper the name of his best friend. I never betrayed you, and I never betrayed the revolution. I just didn't want to die alone. I needed you to see me home. And if I could save you, and if I could find a solution, I'd die 1,000 times to get you out of here. Sharing the same cold cell, betrayer and betrayed. An island with two frightened castaways. Not a word is spoken. How can he explain? Through swollen eyes, they watch the dawn's first rays. It's all over now. They stand next to the wall, waiting for the fascist sword to fall. In the desperation of a young life about to end, he turns before the bullet and forgives a friend. I never betrayed you, and I never betrayed the revolution. I just didn't want to die alone. I need.
Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this session in our series of Jewish Literary Festival at Home webinars. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope that your high holidays were filled with family, food, and much joy, and that the year ahead will bring sweetness as we emerge from this very, very strange time. As always, season ticket holders have access to all sessions until the end of the series, but single session tickets can still be purchased through SnapScan or EFT. So tell those friends who may find a session of interest that they can sign up and pay only 40 Rand. Details are on our website, jewishliteraryfestival.co.za. Our panelists are, as always, eager to answer questions, so please type them into the Zoom Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, which will be available throughout the session. Those questions will then be answered by our guests during the final 10 to 15 minutes of the webinar. And then, of course, please watch your inbox for invitations for the upcoming events. Our guests tonight are no strangers to your screens and always bring topics of conversation that are thought-provoking. Tonight, we delve into the shadow world of espionage, betrayal, and deceit with Jonathan Ancer's book, Betrayal, The Secret Life of Apartheid Spies. And Gus Silber will be probing into what it takes to live a life of deception. Jonathan Ancer is a journalist who has worked as a reporter at The Star, the editor of Grocot's Mail, and a crossword columnist for the Cape Times. He's won many awards for breaking news, feature writing, and creative writing, and produces a great author podcast called I'm a Booker Booker. He's the author of Spy, Uncovering Craig Williamson, which was chosen by the Sunday Times as one of the top 10 books of 2017. His latest book, Betrayal, The Secret Lives of Apartheid Spies, was published in 2019. Gus Silber is also an award-winning journalist, editor, speechwriter, and author, with a very special interest in social entrepreneurship. He's penned several books covering South African socio-political satire, innovation in business, entrepreneurship, and mobile technology. He has, over the last few years, written some extraordinary commentary pieces on his journeys around the neighborhood in Johannesburg and posted them to Facebook. His latest book is Electric Graffiti and brings those digital missives to the page and is a collection of over 50 of Gus's most loved social media posts. So, settle back and enjoy this conversation with Jonathan and Gus as we enter the murky and sometimes surprising world of apartheid spies.
Hi, and good evening, Jonathan. Can you hear me okay, first of all?
I can hear you perfectly. Thanks, Gus.
Excellent. Good to be chatting with you again, Jonathan. I'd like to start off by something that I learned today that I found quite extraordinary. Your book, Betrayal, has actually inspired a fashion range that was launched last week in Paris, and that appears in the esteemed pages of Vogue magazine. We've actually got some images. The range is called Counterintelligence, and it's by an award-winning young designer born in Kimberley and now working in Johannesburg called Tebi Magugu. Tell us a little bit about how this came to be, Jonathan. It's definitely the first time I've heard of a non-fiction South African book inspiring a fashion range on the catwalks of Paris.
Well, anybody who knows me will be very amused that the book, well, that I have inspired any sort of fashion range. It started because I received an email from Tebe. At first, I thought maybe it's Leon Schuster who's trying to pull my leg, but he had read the book quite soon after it came out. He's from Kimberley, and one of the spies that I write about, Jenny Miles, was also from Kimberley, and I think he was quite intrigued by her, and he was intrigued by the spies, and he wanted to know a little bit more about them, what motivated them to become spies. And we started having this conversation. And he then told me that he was going to launch this collection, this fashion range. And he started asking for some details. He did track down some of the spies himself, and he spoke to them. And in one of the outfits, he's put very subtle details in the outfits, and we talk in journalism about how a story has got legs, and which means that it can travel and grow. And in this case, the book clearly had very long legs because it's strutting down the catwalk. But yeah, so that's how it came to be.
Yeah, how do you personally feel about this kind of link here? Here we see some of the images. This is the spy who spied for Cuba, and she's from Kimberley as well. So you see he's directly been inspired by the stories in your book to the extent of actually speaking to some of those spies himself. So Jonathan, how do you feel about this kind of, this is almost an extreme example of glamorization of espionage and spying. And we have numerous, every single streaming service at the moment has got at least one series about spies, whether they're Mossad spies or Russian spies or American spies. What's your personal feeling, having written 2 books about espionage, about this association of spying with glamour?
Well, I think, yes, I think spying is very much part of popular culture. But I think what he's done is much more nuanced. And I don't think it's that glamorous. I don't think he's glamorizing it. I don't think the fashion is glamorizing it. And I think it's quite subtle, what he's saying is that spies live among us. They're ordinary people. And I think he was quite taken with that idea. This dress, I think, has those dots are Olivia Forsyth's fingerprints. So there are some very intriguing details, and I think that's what he's saying, is that there are spies that are everywhere. And I found the connection quite interesting. I'm really the last person who should be talking about fashion, But I found the connection really fascinating.
Yeah, Jonathan, just tell us a little bit about the process of your research and your interviews. Given that the subjects you were speaking to, and given that the title of your book is Betrayal, you were actually speaking to people who were trained specifically to deceive and to mislead and to outright lie, I suppose, and to lead double lives. To what extent were you kind of, what sort of relationship did you have with them, where that you could trust them and they could trust you, given this kind of background that they had of betrayal? Was it an obstacle for you in speaking to them?
Oh, absolutely. Because they, it is part of, I think it was, it's part of their job description to deceive, to lie. And it was one of the spies who spied on apartheid. So I looked at spies from both sides, people who spied for apartheid and people who spied on apartheid. And one of the anti-apartheid spies, Roland Hunter, he told me that spies are trained to lie. Every part of what they're doing is about lying. They're deceiving not only the people that they're spying on, but they're deceiving their family. They are in this, they're developing a double life. And he said that it took him a long time to learn how not to lie again. And he had only been an active spy for a year. And some of the people that I spoke to had spied for more than 2 decades, and had been underground in deep cover positions for years and years. And he says that he's told me that it took him so long to learn to unlearn how to spy, to unlearn how to lie, because it came so naturally. So I think it was part of it. And what I did is I was very interested in that betrayal aspect of it. So I went to track down the people who had been betrayed, and to try and get a sense of whether they could forgive the person that had betrayed them, and also to try and get a sense of how the spy had operated. And it's a very murky world.
Yeah. Did you find any common thread at all between the agents, the spies that you spoke to, in the sense of them coming to terms with what they had done and either being remorseful or wanting to apologize? Were they all different? Is there any kind of common kind of ground that spies tend to have long after their work in the field?
It was very different. I think there were some aspects of the spying. I think Roland Hunter probably stands out as somebody who didn't want to be a spy. And, I called him an accidental spy. He just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, or the right place at the right time, depending on your perspective. He really didn't want to go into spying. But most of the others, and in fact, all of them, chose to become spies. They wanted to spy. Roland thought it was his duty to get this. He had stumbled upon information that he felt he had to get out. But others were motivated for very different reasons, some for money. I think the common thread among the others is a sense of power, a sense of belonging, a sense of excitement. And ideology didn't really seem to play much of a role.
Yeah. In your book, Jonathan, which, by the way, if anyone out there hasn't read it, it really is a terrific book, not just in terms of its subject matter, but in terms of its place in South African nonfiction literature. You mentioned at one point the acronym MICE, M-I-C-E, which stands for money, ideology, coercion, and ego or excitement. So this is what you were talking about, this mix of motives that people have in order to become a spy. It seems to be a real kind of area of specialist expertise that is studied and that people take very seriously. And did you get the sense that these spies that you spoke to were kind of very serious about the actual work that they'd done? In other words, were almost kind of professionals and experts to the extent of having acronyms to this, and you even have a long algebraic formula here to kind of sum up what spying is all about. It seems to be a highly kind of complex. It's not just as simple as pretending to be somebody else.
Yes, I mean, I sort of joke, maybe, well, and that, MICE is the acronym. It should rather be RAT, because a rat is a spy in crosswords, which is, you know, that's the synonym for a spy. The one spy who really was a professional was Dieter Gerhardt, and he's the one who came up with that very long. He gave a lecture to the Spook Academy after he had been unmasked, after he had served his sentence, and he was embraced by the ANC. And they brought him into their academy, and he trained spies on spycraft. And he developed this acronym. And so MICE is probably quite effective. I think it was the CIA who came up with that acronym, and it is studied. There is a field of study where people study the motivations for spying, the psychological impact of what it means to become a spy, who becomes a spy. So there is a kind of there's a large area of interest in spying. I do think that people have a number of reasons. It's not just one, it's not just money, and it's not just ideology, and it's not just coercion, or it's probably a whole bunch of reasons that motivate people to spy.
Yeah. Jonathan, when you were doing your interviews particularly, did you have to be very diplomatic? I mean, to call someone a spy, whether or not they were a spy, or as Jacob Zuma did with Derek Hanekom, called him a known enemy agent, and that led to a long legal battle. There's something about the word spy that on one level it's kind of glamorous because of movies. On the other level, it's just about the ultimate kind of slur you can level at somebody. Did you have to kind of watch your tongue a little bit? What is the preferred term for someone who's been an agent? Do they kind of see themselves as something more kind of complex than a spy or an agent?
What Craig Williamson, who did spy for he spied for the apartheid government, he told me, he said, we are agents, the enemy are spies. Okay. So, you know, he saw it in that way. And I think that is how people see themselves. They're secret agents, and the other side is, you know, they are the spies. I think it has some negative connotation, but it has been quite glamorized. You know, the sort of James Bond aspect of it.
Yeah. At one point in your book, you quote the famous or infamous English agent Kim Philby as saying, "You can't betray if you don't belong." He says, to betray, you must first belong. And then he says, I never belonged. The sense there that people who choose this for profession are inherently, to begin with, outsiders, and they don't belong. And that's, I suppose, why they can kind of choose this profession and do it without the feeling that they are betraying. Did you get the sense from the people that you spoke to of being outsiders and not belonging?
Many of them, yeah. Many of them. And I think this was their opportunity to be part of something that was secretive, something where they felt important, that they were influencing events, they were influencing the outcome of what was going to happen. And a lot of them are recruited when they're students. And I think it's because students are quite vulnerable, they're quite easy to be manipulated, they ideologically quite immature. And I think this is where especially the special branch would go hunting for potential recruits. And a lot of the spies came from the universities. Some were very, very, I think were kind of abused, some of you know, and were victims themselves. Some, I think, went into it knowing what they were doing, and then, you know, weren't victims.
Yeah. I just want to ask you about the technology and the kind of process associated with spying. I think probably in the sort of, you know, if you look at the golden era of spying, the 60s and the 70s and then the Cold War, the technology by our standards today was quite antiquated. Today we have smartphones, we have social media, we have Google, we have very easy ways of finding information. In your kind of understanding via your research and so on, has this actually changed the world of espionage in a big way? Is it kind of easier to do now because of the tools at our disposal, or is it harder because you have to find other ways to get information?
I think it's easier. I think, you know, Dieter Gerhard, for example, when he wanted to communicate with his handler, who was in Moscow, he could only communicate, you know, through sending little satellite bursts, and then receive orders. And maybe once a year, there would be an arrangement where he would either leave the country or the handler would come into the country. So I think on that level, it's much easier for people to talk to each other. I think it's also very easy for governments to monitor individuals. The technology is there. You know, we're being listened to. It's a no secret. I suppose it's more difficult in the sense that there's everybody's spying on each other, and you don't quite know, you know, who is spying on who.
Yeah. Now, quite recently, this term stratcom has been used a lot as an insult, referring to journalists who practiced their journalism in the apartheid era, and it's become an all-round slur. It's often used by the EFF and other organizations to kind of go beyond just saying your news is fake, but you're actually an active agent. So many spies in the apartheid era that you cover seem to have come from a journalism background, from Rhodes and so on. In your studies and working in the newsroom and so on, did you ever personally come into contact with anyone who you suspected might have been working as an agent?
Not when I was a reporter. When I was a student, I was definitely convinced that there was one of our friends, well, not a friend, somebody in our circle was a spy. I'm sure he wasn't, but no, yeah, no. I never came across anybody who in the newsroom that I thought was a spy.
Yeah. Jonathan, tell us a little about Dieter Gerhard. You mentioned a couple of times, and he was a Commodore at Simonstown Naval Base, an extremely strategic base during the apartheid era. You mentioned a little while back that he was the most professional of the spies. His story is very different to the others. I mean, he was a master spy, wasn't he? Tell us a little bit about what happened with him eventually. He did serve a prison sentence, and what happened subsequently, but he was very famous or infamous at the time.
Yes, yeah. So yeah, you know, South Africa's super spy is sort of considered Craig Williamson because he infiltrated NUSAS, and then in exile he managed to infiltrate the anti-apartheid movement. But the mega spy is really Dieter Gerhard, and he was undercover for 20 years or even longer. And he was sending information. He got very, very high up in the Navy, but also the Navy was part of the South African Defence Force. He was privy to all sorts of secret information about what was happening with NATO, and he was passing on all sorts of information, thousands and thousands of documents. So he was eventually caught in a sting operation in America. He had gone off probably one of the times that he was going to meet his handler. He got caught and arrested. And he and his wife, they were a cell. He was at that time, he was the Commodore of the Simonstown dockyard, and his wife, you know, they were a cell, and they were both arrested and charged with high treason. And he faced the death penalty, and you know, he had gone to P.W. Botha's daughter's wedding, and he was part of their social circle. He had worked with Magnus Milan, who was absolutely, Magnus called him in the autobiography that Magnus wrote, he called him Judas, who betrayed his country for 30 pieces of silver. And Magnus wanted, and P.W. Botha wanted him to be hanged, and he wasn't. He received a life sentence. And I think the reason that he wasn't hanged, you know, for high treason, for giving away secrets to the Russians, can you imagine, during this whole paranoia of the Roy Gafar, and it was probably because the Americans felt that he could be useful in a spy swap at some point, and there were attempts to swap him, and it never came to be. His wife received a 10-year sentence, and she served almost all of the sentence. She took when they offered to the political prisoners, if they renounced violence, they would be freed, and she took the deal. He wasn't offered that deal, and in the negotiations, the National Party didn't want to see him as part of the political prisoners. They still felt so bitter about what he had done that they then decided that his motive, even though he had been convicted of a political motive, they decided that his motive was as a mercenary, and that he had been inspired by money. So they didn't want to release him. And it took the intervention of Boris Yeltsin for him to eventually be released. And that, I think he was one of the last prisoners to be released. And then the condition of his release was for him to be deported, and he went to Switzerland, where his wife was from. And then he came back to South Africa, and he lives now between Cape Town and Switzerland. But he's really a footnote in South Africa's history. He's still undercover. He's still kind of this grey figure. who, he's in his 80s, but very active. And but he has coffee in public places, maybe not anymore, but nobody knows who he is. He's among us. He really is one of the spies who lives among us.
Okay. One of the intriguing propositions that comes out of the book is, and you do quote somebody as saying this, Robert Whitecross, you quote him saying, imagine how many undercover agents never had their cover exposed. So people like Dieter Gerard and so on were exposed through sting operations, as you said. What's your take on that? Do you think that there are actually lots of people who simply carry on life as normal and were very active as spies during the apartheid era?
I have no doubt. I have no doubt that there are, I don't know how many, but lots of people who either are keeping very quiet, or who may not have even realized that they were passing on information to the state. The state had set up all these front companies where they were getting people to pass information to them. But I have no doubt, and very senior people, which is why people start to point fingers. Jacob Zuma hopefully will pay a lot of money to Derek Hanekom for that accusation, which he lost, and he had to apologize. I think that I have no doubt that there are lots of people who are very nervous, and who did spy, and just their covers they've never been exposed.
Yeah, Jonathan, another very interesting thing about your book is this kind of balance between male and female spies. And I think one of the great kind of stereotypes or cliches of spy fiction in popular culture is the seductress, the Matahari, whose job actually is to seduce people in positions of power, and by so doing gain information. In other words, you've got the sun and the mice, but mice doesn't bring sex into it. Did you find
excitement,
excitement. Okay. Is that kind of a standard tactic to seek out an attractive woman who can act as seductresses, and thereby get information in a kind of very old, physical, primitive sense almost?
Well, there were two spies that were very opposite. One was Olivia Forsyth, and I think that was how she operated. I'm not sure if those were her instructions. She was having an affair with her handler, and she was involved with many of the activists at Rhodes, and I think kind of wherever she was, with an ECC activist called Brett Murdow. And then there was Joy Harnden, who was very quiet. She was a hard worker. She was behind the scenes. Nobody even noticed her. She never had any relationships with anybody. And they both were spies. So I'm not sure if that was their, who was more effective as a spy. I think lots of people were more suspicious of Olivia than they were of Joy.
Yeah. Jonathan, since the book was published, what kind of I mean, you've had hugely positive reviews, and your book has kind of been quite a phenomenon in the way it's influenced people all the way through to the amazing fashion range in Vogue. But did you have much negative fallout? Were you yourself actually accused in any way of kind of doing something betrayal-like in the way you translated stories to the printed page? You were dealing with very, I suppose, fragile egos, and you were dealing with a very fraught time in South African history. Did you subsequently come across people who weren't at all happy with the way you told their stories?
There were some people. Surprisingly, the anti-apartheid spies, Roland, not him so much, but people who around him, were unhappy, not with the chapter itself, but with the way the book was sort of marketed as The Secret Lives of Apartheid Spies. And they felt that this is at the time when people are being accused of being spies. Derek Hanekom had just been accused of being a spy, and he's very much part of Roland's story, because he was the person that Roland had gone to be introduced to the ANC. So I think people were quite sensitive around that, because they felt that the subtitle, The Secret Lives of Apartheid Spies, wasn't clear that it was apartheid era spies. And that's really the sort of the publishing trying to market the book and making it sound sexier. But they weren't unhappy with the chapter, and they felt that the chapter represented the story well, but they were concerned that people wouldn't read the chapter and they would just be persuaded by the title. I did have a fight with Olivia Forsyth afterwards. Somebody contacted me, somebody that she had betrayed, a student, in fact, an activist from Grahamstown at Rhodes University, who his house was petrol bombed and his girlfriend was killed in that. And he had turned to Olivia. I think Olivia was the first person he had contacted, and she came and she actually took his girlfriend to the hospital, and she died a few days later in the hospital. And he contacted me and he wanted me to facilitate a sort of, I don't know if it was a reconciliation, but he wanted to kind of have an engagement with Olivia. And he asked me if I would contact her. And I did. I wrote to her. I didn't want to. At that point, I was kind of sick of these spies. And she, even though I had interviewed her for the Craig Williamson book, when it came to speaking to the second book, and I asked her for an interview, she refused. And she said, "Look, I've spoken to you already, and all the information is in my book, in the book that she wrote." And she said she doesn't want to talk about it anymore. So I wrote the chapter about her without speaking to her for a second time. But what I did is I kind of dissected and deconstructed her book, and I went to people that knew her and engaged with her and were part of that story. And they basically said that her story is a complete fabrication, and I write about it. And so she was very unhappy with that chapter, and I said, well, I interviewed all these people, and she said, yes, you're just their stooge. And I wrote back, I said, you really are the last person in the world to call anybody a stooge. Yeah. And she conceded that at least. She said, yes, you're right, I am. but yeah, so that was the negative fallout from Olivia.
Jonathan, one thing that fascinates me about your book is the diversity of characters and the diversity of motives and so on. I'm just wondering whether you kind of drew any conclusion from face-to-face speaking to people. Do you think that spies are more effective if they are charismatic, if they have kind of magnetic personalities and are larger than life, or if they are kind of almost invisible, a kind of person you wouldn't even notice, and who you'd be the last person you'd suspect they'd be involved in anything like that? I suppose you do get both of those characters, but in your opinion, having spoken to people, what struck you as being a kind of more effective character trait for being a spy?
I think it's the invisible, the person who's invisible, who doesn't draw attention to themselves, who's working quietly behind the scenes, building up some trust and credibility. Craig Williamson, people often allowed him. He rose up to be the vice president of NewSAS, which was a very senior position in a very powerful organization. And the reason he did that was because he was the one person who was prepared to do all the admin. He was the person putting up posters. He was sorting out their finances. And so that's how he got in. He got in as the treasurer. Nobody wanted to be the treasurer. Everybody wanted to be the person kind of doing the glamorous work, standing at the front of the protest. But there he was working in the background, and that was very effective. And that's how he wasn't a quiet, invisible person, but he wasn't out there either. He didn't put himself out there. And I think the same with Joy Harnden. She made mistakes in terms of how she operated. She probably did too much too quickly, and she didn't have a background in politics, so she was exposed because of that. But she was also working behind the scenes and very quiet, and she was part of the End Conscription Campaign's media committee, making the posters and being useful. And I think the organizations relied on useful people.
Yeah. Now, Jonathan, our society, at least idealistically, is based on the notion that we kind of forgive and we reconcile and we kind of overcome our tortured and often tragic past. In doing this book, you were actually delving quite openly into that past. You were kind of opening up old wounds. You were speaking about betrayal, which is just such a hugely Shakespearean kind of biblical emotion to talk about. Did you get the sense that we are kind of still a broken society because of what's happened, and the people you were speaking to were right in the fracture zones of that broken society? Or did you get a sense that people have come to terms and that forgiveness is kind of, that people can forgive those who betrayed them? What was your ultimate take from all the interviews you did?
So it's difficult to say, because I do think that the scars of betrayal don't heal very easily. And there were people that I'd spoken to 30, 40 years after they had been betrayed and still had all sorts of very, very profound feelings about it. People that still struggle to trust anybody. And I think, especially people who got close to the spies and were betrayed on a personal level, they felt very hurt and very bitter. And I think it also, that they wanted that sense that they wanted the spy to, they wanted to understand what were the motivations, how could you do this? Some people just wanted to sit down with the spy and say, why me? What is it about me? And some people just couldn't face them. The spy that Joy Harnden, I felt a lot of empathy for her, because I think she really has never ever been able to forgive herself.
Yeah.
And I think she still lives in a world of a lot of pain because of what she had done. And I think Olivia Forsyth, for example, is quite remorseless.
Yeah.
And Craig Williamson, I think they don't see that what they did was wrong. And so I think people were very more willing to forgive Joy But she's really disappeared. She doesn't want to confront anybody. She doesn't want to be confronted by anybody. She wants to carry on living in the shadows. Where Craig Williamson is out and about, and Olivia Forsyth wrote a book about her, you know, setting the record straight, as she called it. And
yeah, so there's a certain narcissistic personality trait that obviously links Williamson and Forsyth. We've got a nice question here from Judith Ancer, which I'd also like to hear your answer to. And she says, if you could meet and interview any spy from any time or place, any era, fictional or not, who would it be and why?
I mean, I was very intrigued by Eli Cohen's story, that he was the Mossad agent who, you know, got very high up in the Syrian government.
Yes.
I think he's somebody that, you know, just the fact that he was so, how he lived that double life, I think would be very, very intriguing and compelling to talk to. There is a documentary series about him, or a Netflix series about his life, but you know, he really kind of was a very important. It played a very important role in you know, in the Middle East kind of, you know, politics and how he lived in such a dangerous time. You know, he lived such a dangerous life. He could be exposed at every second, and you know, when a spy was exposed in South Africa as a, I suppose it's very different for people who were, you know, I looked at white spies, and I looked at for various reasons, but those spies, if they had been exposed like all the people had been, there weren't any consequences. They might have been expelled from New South, but they weren't killed, they weren't imprisoned, or the white apartheid spies. So how to live on the kind of
on a fictional level, Jonathan, any particular fictional spy who kind of you know, you see an equal fascination with?
Let me think.
Okay, we can get back to that one.
I'll get back to it.
Okay, I just wanted to ask you about your process and your technique, not just in this book, but as a journalist by and large. Is there anything that you've done in your career as a journalist that, looking back, kind of now strikes you as kind of being spy-like in tactic and strategy? Because to a certain extent, journalists, you know, they have to uncover information, they have to think by their wits, they very often have to have some kind of subterfuge to what they're doing in order to get a story, especially a long-form, deep dive investigative story. Did you ever kind of see any aspect of what you do and have done as a journalist as being spy-like?
Well, it was actually something that Dieter Gerhard said to me when I met with him, and he said, you know, he's got spycraft, and he said, you know, journalism is about finding information, and all, you know, and that's what spies do. A lot of the information actually is in the open. So be a spy and find the information. And I think that I did do that. For you know, hunting people, stalking them on social media, tracking them. I think I did use quite a bit of spycraft to spy on these people, and I think we do that, not even for journalism, but just in general. I suppose I have been involved in stories where I've pretended, you know, to kind of, I'm just to be somebody else in order to get information.
Jonathan, it seems that spying, espionage, is at its peak in either in a war or in a situation of near war, like the Cold War, or in societies that are kind of oppressed for one reason or another. What's your take about the state of the world today and the state of espionage? I think if you look at the Middle East, for instance, I think we all know that Mossad is a very, very active spying intelligence agency. But just looking generally at the state of the world, what need is there for that level of espionage that you kind of write about, and how active do you think the spies of today are compared to, the spies of the Cold War era?
I think the spies are everywhere. I think the more research that I did, the more convinced I am that everybody's got an agency. Every agency's got a secret agency, and we're being spied on. And it's not only individuals who are being spied on, or organizations. Politicians are being spied on. Everybody. I've become quite paranoid about the level of infiltration, and there are so many different agencies. I've no doubt that every organization is being monitored. There's obviously a need from a security point of view to have spies, and a lot of the spies that I did speak to, especially not necessarily the people that are profiled, but people to get background information, they talk about how essential they are, not only in passing on information, but in stopping assassinations. They talk about stopping politicians from doing stupid things, from developing scenarios, and controlling and influencing events. And I think there's no question to my mind that everybody is spying on everybody.
Okay, so you pretty much answered the question that Nancy Richards asked there, which was, to what extent are people that spy and continue in South Africa today? Now, when you were gaining the trust of your interviewees and telling them that you were doing a book and what it was all about, did you ever get the sense, the uncanny sense, or the outright open sense that your subjects were actually doing some intelligence work on you to find out your credentials and your background? Did you ever have any suspicions about what you were doing from your interviewees?
Well, I'm pretty sure that Williamson spied on me. I'm pretty sure that he would have done that. I think he's quite meticulous about doing his homework. I think they did, look me up, and I'm sure of it. I'm quite open. My social media is all open, and I don't really hide anything. So I wasn't too worried about it, and I was always upfront with people. So yeah, but I do think, I suppose they would have done that. It didn't really bother me though. Yeah.
Now, you've written 2 books on spies, the Craig Williamson book Spy and Betrayal. And are you kind of all spied out? Or are you inspired to make this a trilogy? What are you currently working on? Have you kind of put the pause button on espionage for a while?
Yeah, I know. I'm sick of spies. So I'm working on 2 projects, not spy related, both actually kind of biographical projects. The one is a biography of Pravin Gordhan, which I'm quite excited about. I think he's quite an intriguing character. And the other one is a series of profiles on sort of Jewish activists who played a role in the anti-apartheid movement, but we don't really know about. Kind of who worked under the radar, who made a contribution out of the public eye. So 2 kind of very positive books, projects. So I'm quite excited about them.
Okay, great. So anyone who has any questions, very welcome to ask Jonathan. I think, Jonathan, I'm just going to kind of wrap up by asking you your fascination with the subject and all that you've learned and all that you've come to understand. Is there any single overriding lesson that you draw about human beings and human nature If you look back, not at individuals, but just at the way we are as people? Is there anything that kind of you took away with you as an insight into us, and maybe into South Africans as well?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I think spying is really about betraying trust, and I think trust is so important. So you know, once you've lost the trust, you can't easily win it over. And I think people genuinely and want to trust people. That was my impression of people, that we are very easy to trust people. We very easy to place our trust in people. But once that trust is broken, you can't win it back. And I think the issue of trust was something that I felt I thought about quite a lot. And once that bond of trust is broken, you can't, the relationship, it can't be repaired. So, you know, we need to trust people, but when somebody trusts you, that is quite a, they're giving you something that you should really look after. So I suppose that's something that I really thought about, how important trust is.
Yeah. At the same time, someone who's committed great crimes and betrayed so many people, like Craig Williams, for instance, I mean, he seems to enjoy quite a good life. I mean, he's a businessman, isn't he? I mean, he's not exactly hiding. He's been able to work. He's been able to have a family life. So he hasn't kind of been torn apart by what he did. He's been able to have a post-spy life quite happily and openly, whereas Joy, who you spoke to, seems to be completely torn by it. So you've got these two different poles of reaction. That must have been quite something to speak to both of them and their different understandings.
Yeah, he's really got away with murder. He killed people. He was involved in sending bombs to Ruth First and Jeanette Schoon and her 6-year-old daughter. Recently, about a month or two ago, I got a flurry of calls from some Danish journalists because, Danish and Swedish journalists, because the Swedes were about to make an announcement into the investigation of the Olof Palme assassination. And the Swedes and the Danes had heard that the South African connection was the one that they had decided was, that the investigating officer decided was, you know, responsible for killing the Prime Minister of Sweden, Olof Palme. And so Williamson had been implicated in that. And the announcement came, and they decided, they put blame on somebody who had a lone gunman. And Williamson, so I got all excited. I thought, well, finally, after all these years, Williamson is going to get some comeuppance.
Yeah.
But he never did. He got away with it. He continued to get away with it.
Yeah. What does he actually do, Jonathan? When you actually met him face to face, what was he doing as a living?
He was one of these people who made a lot of money from selling. He's an independent tobacco businessman, so he sells cigarettes. So he's not part of the big tobacco companies. He's got a cigarette company called Craig Benson, which is based in Botswana, and he brings these cigarettes in. You know, he's connected to all these cigarette smugglers, and I'm sure he's made a lot of money selling maybe not so legal cigarettes.
So you must have done quite well during the hard lockdown. Natasha's asked a question here about how families react to being lied to. Now that's a strong theme in your book, which is all about betrayal. I'm curious as to whether there's ever been any kind of informal or formal attempts at reconciliation. You mentioned that some people wanted to sit down with those who betrayed them and so on. there's no kind of formal forum, is there, for doing this as there was during the Truth and Reconciliation years, or is there?
No, there isn't. In fact, the spies, there was a deal that was done where the spies didn't have to go to the TRC.
Yeah.
And that's possibly, because spies from both sides, or both sides didn't want their spies to be exposed. So there hasn't been that. And I think that's why somebody like Jacob Zuma can start pointing fingers at people and saying he was an enemy agent. And that really, it's one of those accusations that how do you defend yourself from you being called a spy? And it was devastating for Derek Hanekom, because he had devoted his life to the anti-apartheid movement, and suddenly for this person to call him a spy was just absolutely devastating. It's like being called a racist. You can't really defend yourself, and the more you try to defend yourself, the more you sound like a racist or a spy. So I think that was a mistake for the TRC not to have the spies and not to air all the dirty laundry.
Okay, so and I just wanted, so there was one more question I wanted to ask you. You're very well known as a cruciverbalist, which is a crossword fanatic. You the only person I know who's actually had a regular crossword column in a newspaper. Just tell us, what is it about crosswords that fascinates you? And there seems to be a little bit of a connection there between kind of the subtleties of espionage and the code words and so on, and crosswords. Is there any connection between these obsessions? And just tell us a little bit about that part of your work.
It was actually when I started working at the Star newspaper and on the night shift as a sub-editor that I got interested in crosswords. And it was because our lunchtime was at about 10 o'clock, and the other sub-editors in the night shift were all very, very, very strange people that were completely antisocial. And so there was nothing to do but the crossword. And that's how I got into crosswords. But I do think there is some sort of idea of cracking a code, which is very addictive. And it's very pleasing to crack the code. In fact, it was during the Second World War, the Daily Telegraph had a competition, and it was set up by the War Department, the War Ministry, and they brought in all these top crossword solvers, and the 5 people who could solve it in under 5 minutes were then invited into to be part of the Enigma code breakers. And they broke German military codes, and they brought, it was, I think there's an estimation that they brought down the length of the war by a year. They reduced the war by a year because they were able to break the Germans' codes.
Okay, so you're not planning to go into the intelligence business and the Enigma cracking business, or you probably could. Okay, well, thanks very much, Jonathan. Great talking to you again, and mazel tov once again on your book, which is well worth reading and rereading for those of you who haven't read it. It's incredibly topical. It's a history book on one level. At the same time, the past, as we know, is never past, and it just seems to kind of reflect not just so much about the society we live in, but about human nature as well. One of our guests tonight remarks that you must have learned an incredible lot about the human psyche. So it's a thriller. It's an insight into human nature, and it's a very riveting read. It has funny moments, it has very moving moments, and I highly recommend it to anyone who wants to understand who we are as a society and who we are as people. Thanks very much, Jonathan. Keep well.
Thank you very much, Gus. Thank you.
Okay, cheers.
Thank you so very much once again to Jonathan and Gus. Another stellar discussion, bringing the world of spies into very sharp focus. Whether one thinks of them as mice or rats, I think the life of a spy is precarious, and the betrayed victim hurt beyond measure when trust is broken. I don't know how anybody can live a life of deception, lies, and just double lives. Well, it's definitely a book that is on our book list, and it's one with extra long legs. I love the idea of the fashion range that has emerged as a result of a very innovative young designer. But thank you once again. Books can be ordered from the Book Lounge on booklounge@gmail.com, or you can call them on 021 462 2425. It's also available online and obviously at all good bookstores. Thank you so much to our audience for supporting us with this JLF, and to the sponsors and donors of JLF 2020, a warm thanks to you, to Natasha Skorek for technical coordination, and of course to the JLF team for program coordination. Next week, we welcome author Barry Cohen as he chats to veteran sports writer Luke Alfred about the book Let Me Play, written by Barry, that tells the story of Papua Sugolum, possibly South Africa's greatest golfer, and his influence in breaking down apartheid. And just a reminder to watch your inbox and diarize Thursdays at 8 o'clock for JLF at Home, or visit our website for further details. Until next week, good night, stay safe, warm, keep out of the wind, and well. Thank you.
Azothengisa izwe lakithi, izwe lakithi, amambuka, amambuka, azothengisa izwe lakithi, izwe lakithi.